before, I'm really pleased to have as a speaker today for this second webinar organized by the Gruppo di Ricerca in Psicosomatica, Professor Michael Sharpe. Professor Michael Sharpe is Emeritus Professor of Psychological Medicine at the University of Oxford in UK and Consultation Liaison Psychiatry at University Hospital in Oxford. He has worked for a long time on medically ill patients with the aim of integrating psychiatric and psychological interventions into their care, and has published more than 300 papers on this topic and on integrated psychological medicine in particular. Michael Sharpe is president of the European Association for Psychosomatic Medicine, and he was also you received both the American Psychiatric Association Adolph Meyer Award for Achievement in Psychiatry Research and the Academy of Consultation Liaison Psychiatrists Eleanor and Thomas Hackett Memorial Award for outstanding contributions to the field. I don't want to take other time because I think that it is more relevant if we listen to Michael Sharpe rather than to me. So please, Michael, the floor is yours, and we are really looking for listening to your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiammetta. That's very kind. It's very kind of you to ask me to speak to you. As you'll probably notice, I'm wearing a warm jacket because I'm in a drafty house in England, and if I was there, I would hope it would be at least a little warmer. So that explains the jacket. So Fiammetta asked me to speak today a bit about what is psychosomatic medicine, in particular, what is research in psychosomatic medicine. So I'll just share my slides. Let's hope it works. Okay. How are we doing there?
Yeah, we can see the slide.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is just say a little bit of background, and then I'm going to say a little bit about what is psychosomatic and biopsychosocial medicine. And I'm going to dip a little into the history. Not that you need to worry too much about the history, but there's a lot of names that come up, and at least I thought we could put them in context. I'm then going to move on to research, and I'm going to say a few words about clinical research in general, and then some words about research in this field. And to make this all a bit more real, I'm going to take us briefly through one of the research journeys I took, which was to understand and treat patients with chronic fatigue. And this is work I did quite early in my career, might be relevant to some of you, and actually wrote up some of it for my doctoral thesis. And then I'll just summarize briefly, and hopefully we'll have time for some good questions. I apologize for doing this in English. I speak absolutely no Italian, so thank you very much for bearing with me. So let's get into a little bit of background. What is psychosomatic medicine? If you say, certainly in English-speaking cultures, it's psychosomatic, people tend to assume that means all in the mind or imaginary illness. So here you are in the cartoon, the psychosomatic doctor in this sense would be a doctor who works in imaginary illnesses. Now, the reason that meaning has happened will maybe be clear to you. We'll go through it in the talk, but there's another meaning for psychosomatic. And this actually goes right back to the idea of the whole person. It goes back to Aristotle and the way that medicine was practiced in the 1700s. The chap on the left is Aristotle. The painting on the right is by a Dutch master called Jan Steen, and it's called The Doctor and His Patients. And it just reminds us about how illness was treated by doctors in the 1700s. So you'll see there's no tests. There's no real diagnostics. It's just a case of listening to the patient, talking to the patient, taking into account their context, assuming there's some bodily disturbance, but not trying to divide what is mental and what is physical. So although in some ways medicine was very poor then because there was not a lot of understanding and very few treatments, at least of the sense of we understand treatments today, this was in a way a golden age because the person was treated as a whole person. So we have these two meanings of psychosomatic, and you'll see they kind of keep cropping up. So this idea that psychosomatic means it's caused by mental, and it's either a imaginary illness or an illness that's entirely caused by mental factors, all in the mind, or this other meaning, an approach that considers mind and body, or we might say biological, psychological, and social factors as important factors in causing and treating illness. We are obviously going to be talking about number two, but some people that you interact with will think you're talking about number one. So it's very important to be clear. So if we go back to the golden age of medicine that was fairly ineffective, but at least tried to address the whole person, what went wrong or what went right, depending on your perspective? So this is another philosopher. This is René Descartes, French philosopher, as you know, again in the 1700s. And his writings were instrumental in clarifying actually an earlier idea that mind was completely separate from body. And this relates to the religious idea of soul being immaterial. So we had an uprise of scientific medicine, which was starting to see the body as a machine. And in this picture, depicted as clockwork. And the body was a machine, there needs to be somebody to drive the machine, to control the machine, and that was the mind. But the mind was quite different from the body. It was a different substance. And so that led to a lot of problems about to explain how the mind affected the body. But nonetheless, it also led to some developments. Because the body was now regarded as a machine, the church started, one can't overestimate, and I shouldn't be saying this to Italians, but one can't overestimate the power of a church in this era. The church started to allow doctors to dissect human bodies. It was bidden previously because the body was sacred. And by starting to dissect bodies, they could look inside and they could start to see the things that were wrong inside the body, the lumps, the abscesses, whatever, that would explain what was wrong with the patient. So you can see this is a big step forward from the doctor in the Yang Steen picture, because they can start to be scientifically understand the body as a machine. And we just fast forward to today, this has led to absolutely amazing technological medicine with fantastic developments in treating a proportion of human ailments. So infection, pretty much conquered, at least for the time being, cancer, great progress being made, and so on. So modern biomedicine is fantastic. So what about the psyche? The psyche got split off by Descartes, remember. People built on this idea of the body of machine, and modern medicine works with the body as a machine, even replacing parts of the machine. So that split off bit, the psyche that would have been left with the church, became conflated with mental illness, and then the science of the mind, early psychologists, and of course the chap there, Freud. And that led to what we might call modern psychiatry and psychology, where it's really a part of medicine that cares for what things we call mental. We have a little bit of developing understanding of how the brain underpins the mind, but largely still, there's a lot of it's done by talking therapy. And the talking therapies have become also very good, evidence-based and effective. The problem is, as you know well, in modern medicine, the mind and the body are quite separate. Psyche and soma have been pulled apart, and they're in different, often different hospitals, different disciplines, different people practicing it. So what this leads to, this rather gruesome image, is that medicine deals with the body, and it's a completely separate group of people that deal with the mind. So medicine has become largely separate from psychiatry and psychology. And why is that a problem? Well, it isn't always a problem, because there are patients who just need medicine and surgery, and they're fine. And there are patients who just need psychiatry and psychology, and they're fine. The problem is there's quite a large group of sick people who really would benefit from having a more joined up view that includes both psychiatry and psychology, a little bit like the old idea of the whole person, not just the person as a machine or just the person as a mind. So that's kind of where we've got to. So what's the solution? So I'm now going to talk a little bit about modern psychosomatic and what we sometimes call biopsychosocial medicine. This is a little history trip, and I'm going to see a few pictures of faces. Don't worry if you don't. It's just I've gone through so you understand a little bit the people involved and how it shaped the field. Now, our friend Sigmund Freud's popped up again. He actually himself did almost nothing with psychosomatics. He was concerned with developing a science of the mind that was going to be as good as the science of the body. It was really mind as machine, a mirror image to the body as machine. But he did set the scene for the idea that the mind could be used more in medicine. I'll come on to that. The other chap there with his pipe, that's Hans Selye, whose name you probably know. And his work was important because he did work in the early part of the 20th century, early and mid, on stress. And you're probably aware that he did experiments showing that if you stress animals or people, they release cortisol. So what that meant is that social situations, psychological situations could affect the functioning of the body, and there was a clear mechanism via the adrenals for how that happens. So that started to really get enthusiasm that we could link the understanding of the mind to do stuff with bodily illness. And then in America, in the early part of the 20th century, there was the heyday of psychosomatic medicine. I'm sure you've heard these names. Franz Alexander and Flanders Dunbar were two big players in the American psychosomatic scene. Bear in mind that America, I don't know how it was in Italy, it never really took off in England, but America went heads over heels with psychoanalysis. And these psychoanalytically influenced people decided that psychoanalysis could be the key to curing medical conditions, and went further to say certain sorts of mental conflicts linked to specific bodily diseases. And perhaps the one that's most often quoted is mental conflicts causing peptic ulcer. Now, we know that the problem here is they oversold the idea. They went too far. And the idea that a mental conflict could cause your disease and psychoanalysis could cure it was clearly overreach. And unfortunately, that rather discredited the idea of psychosomatic medicine. It was also really a bit of this psychogenic idea that problems in the mind cause problem in the body, rather than a more whole person approach. So there's a parallel track going on here, which is the idea of biopsychosocial medicine. And these two ideas of psychosomatic and biopsychosocial are kind of mixed up now. So Adolf Meyer was a Swiss neurologist who went to work at the Johns Hopkins in America in the beginning of the 20th century. And he promulgated this idea that this separation of mind and body didn't make any sense. And he developed an idea of what he called psychobiology, that mind and body were one. I don't think he really developed it very far, but he influenced subsequent people, and particularly this chap here, who is an important person, George Engel, who was a hospital physician, and he was frustrated by the mechanical approach of biomedicine, thought the person was getting missed out, thought that medicine was dehumanizing people. And he developed this idea of biopsychosocial medicine. I would say just a few words about that. His classic paper was in Science in 1977. If you haven't read it, it's very well worth reading, and it's still very relevant today, despite being a long time ago. So he formalized the idea that the biology of the body, their person's psychological state, and their social context were all relevant to illness. And on the right-hand side, these were not just tick boxes, separate categories, but these things interacted together. So your biological state could affect your psychological state, your social situation could affect your psychological state. So he had this idea, used this thing called systems theory, the idea that there was different levels of organization going down to the molecules and right up beyond society, and these levels interacted. Now, this has kind of become mainstream biopsychosocial medicine, and it has been helpful, but it's been criticized reasonably to say it looks very complicated. And how would we start to use this? Now, it's good reminder that when you see someone ill, you need to think about all those dimensions and how they might affect each other. But this diagram on the right, I mean, crazy. What would you do with that in a clinic or in a research study? But nonetheless, if we take a practical approach to this idea of looking more broadly, it's fantastically useful. I'm going to go on to say how we deal with that in research. So what is the legacy of this psychosomatic medicine that's kind of fell away in the United States? It's kind of gone. It's still alive in Germany and a bit of Switzerland, other bits of Europe, maybe a bit in Italy, a bit in Europe. And in Germany, this really, for interesting historical reasons, became a subspecialty of internal medicine where they trained in psychotherapy and focus on having their own patients with certain conditions, particularly eating disorders, these so-called medically unexplained or somatoform conditions, anxiety and depression. And psychosomatic medicine of this sort is still quite a big thing in Germany. Whether it'll survive long term, I don't know, but it's quite separate from psychology and psychiatry. It's a discipline of medicine, often has separate hospitals and clinics. In most of the rest of Europe and internationally, we have psychology and CL psychiatry, consultation liaison psychiatry. My own hospital in Oxford, here we have psychiatrists and psychologists working in medical clinics and medical wards. You may have some of that there. This is my colleague in Harvard, David Gitlin, on an intensive care unit in the Brigham Hospital in Boston. So the other way has been, rather than having our own patients, we form a team with physicians and surgeons and join psyche and soma in that way. I mean, both these approaches have limitations. The psychosomatic medicine is potentially a bit isolated and becomes a bit niche, and just not being a thing, but just joining with psychiatry and medicine is often a very difficult thing to do. Nonetheless, we have made some progress over the 20th and 21st century. So that's just a very brief tour of why we need psychosomatic or biopsychosocial medicine, a very brief history of it, and where we are now in terms of services. What I want to turn to now is research. And I couldn't resist, just after a whole career in research, giving you a few tips about research in general. The biggest problem I find in research, and Fia Mehta edits a journal, so she will see this, is people are often not clear what the question is that they're posing in their research. And if they end up with a vague question or a question they can't answer, it kind of blights the whole project. So it's really important at the beginning to be very clear about what question you're answering and spend a long time getting that right. Make sure you study the right sample. People don't do that. And think carefully about the measures you use. Don't just use, oh, everybody uses this scale. Really think, how does this measure help me answer the question? One of the things I learned from my old mentor was, whatever I said I was going to do a study, he said, pilot it. And all this means is try stuff out. Really try it out before you start the study proper, and you can save yourself a lot of pain down the line. One of the things I've just been reviewing abstracts, as Fia Mehta knows, for our EAPM conference. And a common problem I see in interpretation of data is people get confused between correlation and cause. And they say, well, these two things often go together. Then they jump to the idea it must be the cause. So be cautious in distinguishing between correlation and cause. And in writing your paper, keep it simple. Don't get overcomplicated. And something people miss out, be very open and honest about the limitations. All research has limitations. And it certainly helps the reader and the reviewer if you've been open about what they are. So thank you for letting me get that off my chest. There are just a few general research things. Let's think about psychosomatic research. Well, it isn't really a defined thing. There isn't like, this is exactly what it is. But in general, it's research that's done within that biopsychosocial paradigm. And it doesn't need to be complicated. You don't need to get lost in Engels' systems diagram. It really just means you're considering more than one of those dimensions, usually in relation, but not always, usually in relation to a medical condition. So you might be, common topics might be understanding or treating depression in cancer patients, looking at the physical effects of stress, giving psychotherapy for people with pain. These transcend these dimensions and they go beyond just a simple biomedical model. So what we're trying to do is add value of understanding to just the manners machine, but to do that in a scientific way. And you've got to be really careful not to get it too complicated. There's lots of straightforward things that you can do within this paradigm. The methods for psychosomatic search are the same as all the other methods. And I'm going to walk through these in the research I've done on chronic fatigue. So what is the condition like? What is the patient group like, the subject like? What's going on? Learn about it qualitatively and then see how common those features are quantitatively. Think about how it might work, create a diagram or a model. Compare how these patients or these sample might differ from others, see how specific it is. And the best thing to do once you start to get towards cause is to do experiments. And these could either be laboratory experiments, but often they are clinical trials, trials of clinical interventions. So just to make this a little bit more real, I'll walk you through my own research journey that I started when I was quite junior. I'm not sure I did all of this perfectly well. I'm not sure the answers are always the right ones, but it just walks us through how you might start with a new topic and how you might build up to some kind of answer.